Love is the only freedom from attachment, said Osho. What does this mean, and how can we experience true love and freedom in our lives? In Love, Freedom, and Aloneness by Osho, the provocative and controversial spiritual figure teaches his perspective on what is love, what does it mean to know yourself, the difference between love and lust, what is freedom versus false freedom, what does it mean to be alone, and what is the difference between being alone and loneliness. This is episode 41. I hope you're enjoying the podcast, and if you are, please consider signing up and supporting my work on Substack or Patreon by clicking the link in the description, and help me get this in front of like-minded people by sharing it with your friends and family, and leave a 5-star review on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, or subscribe with the bell if you're on YouTube. Let's get into it. Aloneness is the ultimate reality. One comes alone, one goes alone, and between these two aloneness, we create all kinds of relationships and fighting just to deceive ourselves, because in life also we remain alone. But aloneness is not something to be sad about. It is something to rejoice in. There are two words the dictionary will say they have the same meaning, but existence gives them totally opposite meanings. One word is loneliness and the other word is aloneness. They are not synonymous. Loneliness is a negative state, like darkness. Loneliness means you are missing someone, you are empty, you are afraid in this vast universe. Aloneness has a totally different meaning. It does not mean that you are missing someone. It means that you have found yourself. It is absolutely positive. Finding oneself, one finds the meaning of life, the significance of life, the joy of life, the splendor of life. Finding oneself is the greatest finding in man's life, and this finding is possible only when you are alone. When your consciousness is not crowded by anything, by anybody. When your consciousness is utterly empty. In that emptiness, in that nothingness, a miracle happens. And that miracle is the foundation of all religiousness. The miracle is that when there is nothing else for your consciousness to be conscious of, the consciousness turns upon itself. It becomes a circle. Finding no obstacle, finding no object, it comes back to the source. And the moment the circle is complete, you are no longer just an ordinary human being. You have become part of the godliness that surrounds existence. You are no longer yourself. You have become part of the whole universe. Your heartbeat is now the heartbeat of the universe itself. This is the experience mystics have been searching for all their lives down the ages. There is no other experience that is more ecstatic, more blissful. This experience transforms your whole outlook. Where there used to be darkness, now there is light. Where there used to be misery, there is bliss. Where there used to be anger, hate, possessiveness, jealousy, there is only a beautiful flower of love. The whole energy that was being wasted in negative emotion is no longer wasted. It is a positive and creative turn. This is an excerpt from Love, Freedom, Aloneness, the koan of relationships by Osho. So who is Osho? Osho is Rajneesh, also known as Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He is an Indian mystic who taught that you must engage fully in the world, but remain detached from it. And it is only through this that you can love and be alive. He was against asceticism, which is the dominant way of practicing mysticism in many religious traditions, including Hinduism, Christianity, Islam. Osho taught that we must reject any form of religious organization because they corrupt more than help the individual. But it should be noted that the ashram he founded in Pune, India, has now over 10,000 followers, and currently there are more than 750 centers devoted to his teachings. So even though he taught that you and I should not follow organized religions, he ended up creating one intentionally or unintentionally. In one of his talks that I listened to when I finished reading this book, just so that I can get a more comprehensive understanding of who Osho was, one of his followers asked him, who was a better marketer, Ronald Reagan or Osho? And Osho's answer was, he was better than Ronald Reagan. He was the best marketer. And this book, compared to some of the other books that we've studied, At times, in certain sections, feels like it's a marketing stunt, especially when he's talking about sex in relation to love and freedom. He says certain things that makes you question whether he genuinely means what he says or he's saying it because he wants to be controversial. And the reason I say this is that Osho was famous for driving a Rolls Royce and wearing a Rolex watch. So part of me feels like he purposely adds flair or says some eclectic things in his teachings just to simply stoke the fire and controversy against him, because he knows that controversy will get him more attention, will get him more followers, will get people listening to it just to hear what he's saying. And so to me, this book is 65% wisdom, 35% marketing. However, the wisdom section is quite solid, especially when he's speaking about aloneness versus loneliness, which is very similar to the idea of solitude that I've spoken about multiple times in different episodes. There's also wisdom when he's talking about loving yourself versus knowing yourself and what that entails. The other thing is Osho reminds me of Jiddu Krishnamurti, especially when he's criticizing religion and the idea of having a guru teaching you, because both of them insist on you knowing yourself and insist that the answers that you seek usually are found in your, to use Osho's word, aloneness. And their criticism, Krishnamurti and Osho's criticism of religion, mainly stems around the idea that religion tends to tribalize those within the group and turn other people who are not within this group, within the religion, and their enemy. And both of them don't think that this is the way to love, this is the way to live as humans. He also reminds me of Alan Watts in that Watts, for all his wisdom, purposely lives a debaucherous life, which he happily admits in his autobiography. And Osho, will get to it later on, but he encourages free love, polygamy, and to live like this because it is the freest. And we'll get to that later on. For more on Krishnamurti's teaching and Watts' teaching, check out episode 19 and 17 respectively. But having said this, one of the most important messages for Osho is that there is ultimately no distinction between meditation and love. They are the same, two sides of the same coin. And I quote, "Love and meditation should go hand in hand. That is one of the most essential messages that I would like to share with you. Love and meditation, meditation and love, and slowly, slowly you will see a new harmony arising in you. Only that harmony will make you content." The majority of his book is spent talking about love and what it means to be love and what it means to love. And for Osho, true love originates from one's pure consciousness, right? Not the physical body, and it is the connection to truth itself. For Osho, people mistake love with lust. Lust arises from the body, love arises from consciousness. So he writes, "This love that can become a contact with truth itself arises only out of your consciousness, not out of your body, but out of your innermost being. Lust arises out of your body. Love arises out of your consciousness." He makes this distinction because Osho wants to say that love, with a capital L, is ultimately God. And love, if it is God, then there can be no lust within God. And lust then arises out of our flesh, out of our bones, out of our materiality. And so our goal is to transcend lust, to remove lust from our lives and to seek love in all that we do, in all our relationships. And the second part to this is, for Osho, love and truth are interchangeable. And he says that Socrates understood this, understood that love and truth are the same thing, two sides of the same coin. So he writes, Socrates is right. One who knows love also knows truth because they are only two names of one experience. And if you have not known the truth, remember that you have not known love either. What Osho is getting here is, if you claim to know truth, or if you claim to have love, but your life is no different, if you claim to know truth and claim that you have a monopoly on truth, but you do not have love, for Osho, you actually don't have truth. Because when you possess truth, when you apprehend truth, you cannot help but have your life filled with love. And if you claim to have love in your life, if you claim that you have experienced love, if you claim that you are full of love, but you don't have truth in you, you don't speak truth, you don't act in truth, then for Osho, these are incompatible statements. For Osho, love is sharing. Love is this outpouring of yourself, right? He writes, love is sharing, greed is hoarding. The idea is when you are filled with love, you cannot help but find somebody else to share this love with, right? To give your love because your cup is overflowing. And you share this love not because you have a duty to some god or some religion or some guru or some teacher, but you do it because you cannot help but do it, right? It's no longer a duty, but it becomes an inevitable outpouring because you are now a servant of real love in its ultimate form, in its ultimate purity, to use this terminology here. And very early on he writes, my teaching is love-oriented. I can drop the word God very easily. There is no problem. But I cannot drop the word love. And that is because love is God. And the term God has a lot of baggage depending on who you're talking to. So for Osho, he can drop the word God because for him, God and love are the same thing. If you claim to love God but hate your neighbor, you really don't love God. Because if you did love God, you wouldn't hate your neighbor. You wouldn't hate somebody who looks different than you. If you love God, you are, in a very real sense, unable to hate the other person, to hate your neighbor. But it is for this reason, near the end of the book, Osho talks about how most people do not love, because if they did truly love, there would be no hatred, there would be no jealousy, there would be no sense of anger towards other people, because they would know that being angry towards another person, hating another person, right, despising them because they look different than you, because they are from a different place, from a different religion, is completely at odds with this idea of loving God. Because those people you hate, are actually made in the image of God. And so for you to actually hate them, it means that you're hating God. But you're hating them in the name of love. You're hating them because you love God. And this becomes incompatible. And you can see why. And on that note about loving others, Osho says this idea of loving others, this advice that you should love somebody else, you should love your neighbor, you should love your family, your husband, your wife, so on and so forth. There's something wrong with this idea because inherent in it, there is a self-condemnation that takes place. People who teach this love others, so on and so forth, according to Osho, don't understand that to love others, you actually first have to love yourself. And that requires self-love. And self-love is seen as selfish. And therefore, these teachers and priests and gurus and philosophers will tell you, love others. But Osho says, you cannot love others if you haven't first loved yourself. And so he writes, they say love others because they know that if you cannot love yourself, you cannot love at all. But they go on saying, love others, love humanity, love God, love nature, love your wife, your husband, your children, your parents. But don't love yourself, because to love oneself is selfish according to them. They condemn self-love as they condemn nothing else. Osho has a point here, in that if you do not love yourself, then how can you extend love that you do not have? If your cup is empty, how can you offer water to somebody else? But to love yourself, there is a prerequisite step, right? And that is to know yourself. And we've talked about the importance of knowing yourself and how that feeds into understanding this life, having a sense of meaning, into finding purpose. But Osho actually criticizes this Greek idea of know thyself. But later on, reverts, and we'll get to that in just a bit. Osho is critical of this concept of knowing thyself because he says knowing yourself doesn't get you to the most important part of life, which is to love yourself and love generally. So he writes, Socrates says know thyself, Buddha says love thyself. And Buddha is far more true, because unless you love yourself, you will never know yourself. Knowing comes only later on. Love prepares the ground. Love is the possibility of knowing oneself. Love is the right way to know yourself. He's saying love is the foundation to actually knowing yourself, because if you don't have love, you will refuse to know yourself. For in knowing yourself, you might end up hating yourself. So instead, Osho suggests you have to love yourself first and to be filled with love. Only then can you explore and know yourself. And that is the way you should do it. That is the order. But as I mentioned, later on in the book, he ends up stressing the importance of knowing yourself, as this is the first step towards loving yourself. He writes, first, be thyself. First, know thyself, and love will come as a reward. What we can take from this is that his initial criticism, which is early in the book, is that of informational hoarding. At least that's the way I interpret it. Right? Someone who is so engaged in falsely knowing themselves because they go to therapy or they read books or they write journals. They're so caught up in this idea that they actually know themselves because they are doing or supposedly doing the things that they want to do. Osho stresses that we'll do anything actually than knowing ourselves, because this requires patience, and for this journey to know yourself, it is very painful. So when he's criticizing in the beginning this idea of know thyself, he's criticizing people who are simply hoarding information and not taking any action. And so when he later on says, the first thing you have to do is be yourself and know thyself, it means that you have to embrace your existence. And in embracing your existence, you end up knowing yourself. And only then can you traverse this chasm between knowledge and love, or love and knowledge, right? And there you can start to love yourself. So he has this repeating line throughout the book, which is, love yourself and watch, today, tomorrow, always. Here, he's driving home the point that it is a constant process of loving yourself. It is a constant process of watching yourself, watching your thoughts, watching your actions, and not being satisfied that today you loved your wife, your husband, your children, your parents, your friends well, but constantly when you wake up tomorrow, being on guard, making sure that you are continuing this journey of love and always reevaluating whether you have done what you ought to have done versus doing something out of pure duty. And when you do this, then you will become a happy person. And so on happiness, Osho writes, a happy person belongs to himself. Why should he belong to any organization? That is the way of an unhappy person, to belong to some organization, to belong to some crowd, because he has no roots within himself. He does not belong, and that gives him a very, very deep anxiety. He should belong. He goes and becomes part of a political party, of a revolutionary party, or anything, a religion. Now he feels he belongs. In that paragraph, there's both truth and falsehood. First, there's a sense of contradiction within what he's saying, because Osho is against organized religion, right? But he ends up creating one. To me, when I'm reading this, I'm laughing because on the one hand, he says religion is bad. People who are unhappy are only the ones who seek out some sort of organization so they can belong to it. But a happy person belongs to himself and therefore is actually not part of any organization. Now, that may be true in Osho's own life because he actually doesn't belong to any religion. But he ends up creating a religion where other people can join and they find this guru, Osho himself, and they fall and listen to his teaching. So there's this inherent contradiction that takes place. On the other hand, if we look at somebody like Krishnamurti was consistent, in my opinion, in that he made sure that there was no organized religion formed after his death, because he insisted that there should be no guru, there should be no teacher, that the truth, the love that you seek is inherent within you, but it's just that most people aren't willing to find it because the path is painful, and instead they rather find it in a religion where they're not obligated to do the work. So this raises the question to me, are Osho's followers then and now unhappy persons that he is speaking of? According to this paragraph and according to what he says in Love, Freedom, and Aloneness, they would be. Now, there is truth to what Osho is saying about the happy person and the unhappy person. Right? There is truth behind this veil, this contradiction. And it is that only one who loves himself or herself, knowing their flaws and their ugliness, their history, is the one who can be happy. Because without loving yourself, you will eternally be seeking validation from other people. You will chase the goals that society sets for you. You will run the treadmill of seeking praises from other people until the very end of your life. And then you might realize in the last few years that perhaps this was the wrong way to do it. And so you spend the last few years trying to redeem yourself. Don't mistake happiness for an emotion, as many people do. Joyfulness is an emotion. True happiness is serenity. Right? It's a state of being. In seeing that this life we live is short, is ephemeral, like the autumn leaves blowing in the wind. And understanding that we are born naked and naked we will die. So you're not easily swayed by the trappings of society, of what people want you to do, of the validations that other people seek. Because in knowing yourself and in loving yourself, your roots have grown so deep into the ground that you cannot be swayed anymore. And that is the happy person that Osho is speaking of. The opening quote, "Love is the only freedom from attachment," is a quote from the book of Mirdad, which Osho quotes. And the full quote is, "Love is the only freedom from attachment. When you love everything, you are attached to nothing." And as I mentioned, the goal for Osho in his teaching is to get people to understand that it is not detachment that you should be seeking, but it is full engagement with the world. To fully love, right? That is what this life is about. And only when you fully love do you become fully attached to things. Detached, I should say. Because when you love everything fully, then you no longer become attached to anything. And Osho's warning is that if you avoid love, you become the living dead. You become a zombie. So he writes, yes, you breathe and you eat and you talk and you go to the office every day till death comes and releases you from the burden that you were carrying your whole life. He's saying you look human, you do human things, you talk, you go to office, you get married, you have kids, you have friends, but your inner life is completely empty. It's hollow. You are an empty shell. So when death comes, he says, it releases you from the boredom that is your life. And you may think that your life is full of life, full of excitement because you do all these things, right? You are doing things that give you temporary pleasures from this world. But for Osho, that life that you live is actually a life of lust, not of love. Because if you love, right, if you're actually living a life filled with love, your life would look completely different. But because you're so caught up in this lust for this world, that life that you're living, this life that you're living, is an empty life. And you'll only see this right at the end. So he has this quote on love. Love leads to the ultimate experience called love, called the absolute, called the truth. These are only names. In fact, the ultimate has no name. It is nameless, but love leads towards it. You can see why he says, if you love, then you would not live this life of boredom, even though they may be things that you think are important. For in love, you realize that love is God, is the absolute reality, is the ultimate reality. And you are drawn towards that. And in you being drawn towards it, the pleasures of this world fade from you, and you seek after that eternal pleasure, that eternal happiness that he talks about. This idea that the absolute reality has no name, because inherent within our language is finitude. Our language is temporary. It is finite. And so all the concepts of God, when we attain to God, when we go towards God, start to crumble. And so this is a consistent theme amongst the Hindu mystics, the Christian mystics, the Buddhist mystics, the Islamic mystics. And we've looked at a few mystics already, so if you haven't listened to those episodes, check those out. But this idea that love is God, that love ultimately has no name, or I should say God ultimately has no name, is inherent within this tradition of mysticism. There's a commonality, there's an underlying principle that all of these mystics share. So then we get this important question. How can you know love? For Osho, no amount of philosophical or theological argumentation or discourse will help you cross the threshold from information hoarding to grasping the fullness of love or grasping the fullness of knowledge. Because that chasm is only crossed when you experience it, when you've engaged in it. So then, how can you know love? How can we know love? Osho's answer, and I quote, "The only way is to become a lover. Be a lover and you will know. And if you are trying to stand outside the experience and just be an observer, then you may know about love, but you will never know love." What does he mean that you may know about love but never know love? You could know about love, meaning you could tell somebody what love is. You could describe it. You can describe the feelings around it. You can describe how the other person might feel. You can describe what it says in the dictionary. You can describe what other people have talked about love is. But you yourself will never know what that means. You don't understand. You don't grasp what those words are pointing to. You don't grasp what those words are trying to say because you yourself have never loved. This reminds me of what some of the Sufi mystics said, right? And they say, mysticism without annihilation is like a bird without wings. Meaning that if you have not killed your ego, right? If you have not understood that it is about love, it is beyond the ego. And so you are like this bird. You are talking about love. You are speaking about love, but you have never actually loved because you've never flown. It's only when you take flight, then can you understand what it means to fly. So Osho writes, love is not something that you can get from someone who has not attained to blissfulness. And this is the misery of the whole world. Everybody's asking to be loved and pretending to love. His point is, no matter what somebody says, right, you cannot get love from somebody who has not understood or grasped love themselves, right? Because everybody is seeking love from other people who have not attained love, who have not loved themselves. It is only people who've loved themselves who can give their love to others. But he's saying, our world is filled with misery because we actually don't love ourselves. And we are all instead seeking external love from other people. And this is causing misery and pain in this world because everybody's pretending. And pretense is not substance here. And Osho quotes an Indian mystic Kabir, and I read, "I had been searching for truth, but it is strange to say that as long as the searcher was there, truth was not found. And when the truth was found, I looked all around, I was absent. And when the truth was found, the seeker was no more. And when the seeker was, truth was no more." He brings this up to emphasize that when you truly love, you disappear. Your ego fades away. Your ego melts. Your ego gets annihilated. And this is what the Islamic mystics say. They say the mystic who has not annihilated himself is like a bird without wings. And Osho is here saying the same thing. Your ego fades when you finally find truth. You are absent. You cannot find yourself. And truth, again, to go back to what we were saying, truth and love here are two sides of the same coin. And so when you find truth, you are fully in love with a capital L. And you realize that you are not there. You are absent. But when you, the seeker, are present and when you are aware of yourself, truth is missing or is nowhere to be found. And this is because love, true love, is dying to yourself. And only in this death can you understand what this love is. But until you have died to yourself, you are simply living for yourself, for your lust, for your ego. And for Osho, this is what leads to a life of misery. And you don't know this until the very end. And Osho is here trying to awaken his readers and his followers. Now, in this book, there are a few sections where he talks about love in relation to sex and lust in relation to love and lust in relation to sex too. So his point is that lust is not love, which I've mentioned. Lust arises out of the body and love from pure consciousness. And that more often than not, most of us confuse these two things as if they're the same thing. Hence why, according to Osho, there's so many divorces in this world. And also why we are against premarital sex. Specifically in the West, he's in America when he's talking about this. Again, this is around the 60s and 70s. So he's saying we're against premarital sex because we have confused love and lust. He also says that it is our lust that drives us to get married. And what often ends up happening is the lust quickly burns up after the honeymoon and is gone. And what you find is not love, but is rather the ashes, the burnt lust. And his point is that what we should be doing instead is not seeking lust, but seeking love. And it is here that we diverge, him and I. Because Osho goes on to say that for this reason, because love is freedom, it means that we should be free to love. And be free of the notion of monogamy, be free of the notion of being faithful to your lover, because this is very restrictive and it is anti-freedom. And instead we should embrace a form of polygamy. Now he never uses the word polygamy. He says things like, quote, I am in favor of love, be true to love, and don't bother about partners. Whether one partner or many is not the question. The question is whether you are true to love. Then he goes on to say that so long as you're in love, remain with your partner. But the moment love is not there, feel free to leave, or otherwise you'll be trapped. Otherwise you will not be true to yourself. You will not be free. And I quote, always remember, if it is a love relationship, good. Remain. While love lasts, remain in it, and remain in it as deeply committed as possible. If there is no love, it is better to change. There's a false notion I'm finding with Osho around this, that love is an emotion. And it's totally contradictory to his idea that love is pure consciousness. Because pure consciousness is not the same thing as emotions. For if love is pure consciousness, then you don't fall out and in love in the way that he's thinking about it. Because love becomes a verb. To love, act in love, it becomes an action. Osho mentioned earlier, to understand love, we must love, right? We must be in this action of loving. It must become a verb. So in a relationship, if you love, then by definition, you are now expressing love through action. It is no longer an emotion like getting angry or feeling sad. Right? These emotions come and go. But if you love one, if you love your lover, and you've attained to ultimate reality like Osho says he has attained to, and that we should attain to, then there's actually no reason to suggest for having multiple partners or switching partners whenever you don't feel love. And this is why I diverge from him here. It seems that if you truly love your lover, then you will continually act in love towards them, continually cultivate it, because love is no longer an emotion. It might have started out with some passion, but the idea is mature love is a verb. And through acting in love, as Osho says, do you start to understand love, and through that, to bring in Plato or Socrates' understanding of love, of ultimate love, is through the individual love that you have, you start to transcend into higher planes of love and ultimately reach this idea of beauty and love. And that is why I think Osho is not right here. And his point about freedom is completely opposed to how freedom has been understood. Freedom has always been understood not as non-restrictive, not as doing whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do. Freedom has always been understood, at least true freedom, has always been understood to be constrained. Constrained by good character, by virtue, by discipline. So an example that I always use is, if you go into a martial arts academy and you have one person who's dedicated years and years into training that specific martial art, in this case, I'll use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because that's what I train. You have somebody who's trained Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for years and years, and then somebody walks in off the street who's never trained any martial art, and both of these guys go have a match. Because the one who just walked off the street said, I'm free to do whatever I want to do, so let me put up my skills against yours. What you'll end up finding is the one who's trained for years and years will end up winning, 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10 more likely, because they understand the constraints and they've worked through the constraints. Whereas the person who comes in off the street, they're free to move their body however they want. They can do anything they want with their body, but in their freedom, in their misunderstanding of what it means to be trained to express the fullness of his body's capacity, he thinks that it's just flaying his body around wherever he pleases. Whereas the truest, purest, most beautiful expression of the capacity that his body possesses is the one that the trained person displays. But reading Love, Freedom, and Aloneness by Osho, it seems that Osho actually has the opposite understanding of freedom. Right? He thinks that freedom is unconstrained, is to do whatever you please, whenever you please. And I think that's incorrect. But at times, like this quote I'm about to read, he gets it right when he says, freedom gives you the opportunity either to fall below the animals or to rise above the angels. Freedom is a ladder. On one end of the ladder reaches hell, and the other end touches heaven. It is the same ladder. The choice is yours. The direction has to be chosen by you. You and I can always choose to reach and touch heaven or climb down towards hell. And that freedom is contained within us. Right? We can do this. It's this idea of free will that we have. But for Osho, you can't climb towards heaven if you don't know yourself, if you don't love yourself. And to do that, you need aloneness, you need solitude, you need time away from others, from the noise. He writes, aloneness is your very nature. Deep inside, your aloneness is unreachable, untouchable. And this concept of untouchable and unreachable is something similar to what the Stoics talk about, of building yourself an inner castle made of your virtues to which you can run to in times of difficulty and find strength there. And because it is within you, nobody can touch it. Right? It becomes unreachable for others to destroy. But only you can destroy it. You can only know to do this, you have to be alone. Because you know who you are when you're amongst other people, right? You have a name, you have a history, a family, a religion that you belong to, a career you're pursuing. But when you remove all of this, when you're stripped away from this, and you're in this state in which you were born in, with nothing, what are you left with? Who are you then? That is the question we have to ask ourselves if we are to know who we are, if we are to love ourselves. Suddenly, and I quote Osho here, suddenly your personality starts disappearing. This is the fear, the death of the personality. It is there that you have to start seeking the answer for yourself. But when you do this, you will learn to love yourself, for you will finally know who you are. And I quote, you can love authentically only when you are, meaning when you are yourself. Right now, you are only a part of a crowd, a cog in the machine. How can you love? Because you are not. First, be. First, know yourself. And it is in this state of intentional aloneness do we learn about ourselves. His idea of aloneness is solitude, as we've discussed solitude multiple times and how crucial it is and why we need solitude in our life and why we need to cultivate it. For it is the antidote to our noisy society. We cannot mistake solitude, however, with loneliness. And Osho makes this distinction here as well. And he says, loneliness is a misunderstood aloneness. Once you misunderstand your aloneness as loneliness, the whole context changes. Aloneness has a beauty, a grandeur, positivity. Loneliness is poor, negative, dark, dismal. Then he goes on to say, your first and most primary step toward finding the meaning and significance of life is to enter into your aloneness. It is your temple. It is where your God lives, and you cannot find this temple anywhere else. Again, it is this inner castle, untouched by the external world, that you build up slowly over time through study, prayer, meditation, reflection. You have to build this inner temple up or inner castle up. And when we enter solitude, we finally see the transitory nature of this existence that we are living in. We realize that there's nothing external that will give us peace, that will give us happiness, that will give us love. We no longer desire the temporary pleasures of this world. So Osho writes, a solitary becomes an elect. He is the chosen one of existence. Why? Because a solitary never desires anything of this world. He does not need to. He has learned whatever was to be learned from this world. The school is finished. He has passed through it, transcended it. He has become like a high peak which remains alone in the sky. He has become the elect, the Guru Shankar, the Everest. And it is in this that you can finally become free. Free from the trappings of this world, free from the trappings of what the world has to offer you. So I want to end with these two quotes. First one is, only a man who meditates can love himself. Otherwise, you are always escaping from yourself, avoiding yourself. Osho beautifully states that meditation, when it is done properly, or true meditation, is one who can do it when they love themselves. Otherwise, your meditation is a facade. It is false. You're simply trying to escape yourself. The second quote is, the real poet may never compose any poetry because his whole being is poetry. And I thought that quote was beautiful because it encapsulates what it means to live a life of love. Right? When you live a life of love, everything that you do becomes love. Like you are outpouring, you are filled with love. You become one with love. And so with that, the challenges for this week is 1, practice love. In your relationship, extend grace. Forgive faster than you'd like to. Right? Give without expectation. I think this is very difficult. But as Osho has said, love doesn't hoard, only greed does. So extend love when it is most difficult. Second, embrace solitude, embrace aloneness. Right? Schedule some time for solitude where you are not distracted by your phone, by other people, by going out, right? Where you can sit down, either read and then do some sort of self-reflection or go on a long walk by yourself And when I say by yourself, that means not having some sort of music playing in your ear. Simply walk with yourself and use the time to ask yourself the question, who am I? Who am I without all these external things that I've placed upon myself or that have been placed on me? And the third challenge is cultivate awareness in your relationship. Take time to understand the need and emotions of other people who are seeking love. When you see a friend making a mistake or a family member making a mistake, do not fault them and do not drive them into the ground, but instead pick them up, extend the kindness and compassion towards them. Those are the challenges for this week. Don't forget to join my Substack to receive weekly wisdom, exclusive updates, and a first look at my latest creative projects, including the reveal of my newest painting this month. Sign up by clicking the link below, and let's stay connected. And thank you to my supporters, Monica, Mike, David, Marcella. You make this work possible. And if you'd like to support this mission to bring back wisdom into our nihilistic age, you can do so by heading over to my Substack, ijmakan.substack.com, or to the Patreon page. The links are in the description. Till next week, peace.